Hi, this is Dr. Craig Chalquist. I'm Department Chair of East-West Psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies and adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and also a research consultant at other schools. And I wanted to record this slideshow because I get asked a lot, since I teach eco-psychology, why is it that so many people remain in denial about global warming? And so I wanted to talk about the psychology that's involved as I've noticed it. Noticed it in public conversations, in the press, in personal conversations, in classrooms, and even among colleagues. And the denial isn't just about ignorance of the science involved or a discomfort with the numbers that are produced by climate studies. It's actually so pervasive that it's possible for people to walk outside and not register that their senses are telling them that it is indeed hotter, for example, now than it used to be 5 years ago, which actually is happening in many parts of the world. The weather's changing all over the place. And so I want to talk about what that's about psychologically, and then also offer some suggestions for getting past it. So in the first part of this slideshow, I'm going to talk about what a psychological defense is and what purposes it serves. If you understand psychological defense, you'll understand a big piece about climate change denial. Next, I want to give you examples of 12 defenses that I see commonly employed against the awareness of global warming and climate change. And then the third part of this slideshow, I'd like to talk a bit about how to shift that denial away from the underlying helplessness and panic into forms of effective response and action. A psychological defense is something that we see all the time, those of us who have experience as clinicians, as psychotherapists and social workers and counselors. A defense is something that we do mentally in order to pretend that reality is different from the way that it is. And so when we make use of a psychological defense, we're dissociating to some extent. We're repressing our awareness that things are the way they really are somehow, whether inwardly or outwardly. And defenses are something that we learn early, and they're actually a natural part of growing up. We learn to protect our sense of I or me, our ego, from intolerable amounts of anxiety and anguish. And those of us who grew up in abusive homes are especially good at the art of psychological defense because we had to use it so much. But in other homes too, in less abusive homes, or homes that were actually a pleasure to grow up in, there's still a need for some sort of psychological defense because it's useful as a way of giving ourselves a pause while we get ready to assimilate some painful truth that we're not temporarily ready to face. So a defense is not just a failure of moral courage, to put it as Mark Twain might have put it in one of his essays. It may function as such in a public leader who ought to know better, but for the majority of us, a defense is actually something that we use quite frequently. The problem is when the use of a defense becomes chronic, when our sense of reality is chronically warped, when we actually can't face up to what's happening. And then that's not only psychologically dangerous and fragmenting, but it can also be dangerous outwardly and physically as well. And by the way, an underlying pattern of constant use of defenses usually indicates some kind of psychological fragility in the person who does it. So an adult, for instance, who makes use of denial consistently, clinicians would have reason to wonder whether that person was wounded somehow and really never came to terms with it. So as you can see, there are a lot of different kinds of defense mechanisms. This isn't even an exhaustive list, and I'm not going to go through these. But what I do want to emphasize is that there are many ways for us to armor ourselves against a fully embodied knowledge of things that are happening inside and outside of us. I mentioned that when defenses like denial are overused, they can be dangerous. History is full of examples of this. This is a picture of the former British Premier Neville Chamberlain shaking hands with Adolf Hitler. And after this photograph, Chamberlain went back to England and told everybody, "We have peace. We have peace in our time." After which Hitler promptly invaded Czechoslovakia and began to overrun Europe. So denial can and does kill. And at present, just to use another example, there are actually people in island nations who are preparing to evacuate because the denial in the industrial countries about the reality of global warming and what contributes to it has already raised the oceans enough that people in such countries are going to have to find a different place to live. So their very lives are completely changed by what's happening. So in this next part, I want to give you 12 examples of defenses against climate change awareness. These examples are just, they are all relatively common. They're not an exhaustive list, but they should give you an example of how we do this, how we ward off this kind of awareness, so that when you see yourself doing them or other people doing them, you'll know what's going on. And by the way, it's really hard to catch yourself using a psychological defense because it's of the nature of defense to warp reality and to make us unconscious of something that's happening. So almost the only way to ever become aware of a defense is by having enough people in your life that you trust who will tell you you're in denial about something and here's the evidence. And so if you're open to that, then you're able to step back and say, well, I need to think about this and feel about this differently because people I trust are telling me that I'm misperceiving what's happening in ways that are really important. So I already mentioned denial itself. Denial has to do with believing that something's true when it's not, or believing that something's not true when it is. And it's a kind of magical wish fulfillment in the sense of wishing away some painful reality that we're not yet ready to face. So there's a large element of unconscious fantasy involved in it, as opposed to the more conscious kind of fantasy that's involved in creativity and intuition and other ways to actually adapt to reality. Lying and brainwashing has a lot to do with something that's put into us from outside that we internalize. And so many industries have an economically vested interest because they don't want to retool in denying the way things are right now in terms of global warming and mass extinction and other unpleasant ecological realities. And they work hard to keep things the way that they are. They use front companies that look like citizens groups in order to vote against and propagandize against making changes in, for instance, how we transport ourselves, how we use energy, and so forth. So this is part of it too. Internalized brainwashing and lying, and internalizing the propaganda that goes with these things. And that picture in the lower right corner, the crash, always reminds me of how often various auto-related industries have pushed campaigns against any kind of safe public transportation. And so in the US, we're now in the situation of losing more people in traffic accidents every year than we lose in our many ongoing wars. The way our economic system is set up right now, not just in the US, but in big parts of the industrialized world, is that we never see the effects of what we buy. We don't see who works on them. We don't see where they go. This is a picture in China of an e-waste dump. And so when those pieces of reality are cut out of view, then we lose our sense of responsibility for how we live, for the kinds of waste and suffering and trash our lifestyle actually causes. There's not just one, but now several gigantic islands of plastic floating in the oceans of the world that are a direct result of our mass consumption culture. and its planned obsolescence of products. And this is an unpleasant thing to realize, and it creates a great deal of guilt very often in the people who do realize it. So the way to set that guilt out of action when one doesn't want to do anything to respond to it is to simply pretend that it doesn't exist. For about 400 years now, the scientific worldview has brought us many benefits. It also has a shadow side, a side that blinds us, especially when it's combined with industrialization and colonial power around the world. And the blind side I'm thinking of specifically is the worldview that says that everything is a series of parts that are put together, that the world and that ourselves and our relationships are machinery. This is a hopelessly oversimplified view that has gotten us into a great deal of ecological trouble, as I'll explain in a minute. But mechanical thinking too is a defense, especially insofar as it numbs our emotions, our natural emotional responses to harm that's being caused around us, ecological and otherwise. So when we think in oversimplified mechanical terms, we lose our sense of the whole. We lose our sense of how things relate to each other. And so, as an example, the upper left graphic here shows that a cycle that's happening right now where the more we lose ice in the Arctic, the darker the water is because the ice doesn't cover it anymore. So the less sunlight is reflected back into space, the more is absorbed by those darker waters, and the more things heat up. So it's a runaway feedback loop, to put it in systems terms. And most of what we can see under a mechanical worldview doesn't take things like feedback into account because it doesn't see the interactions between the parts. It only sees the parts and oversimplified cause-effect relationships. And so as another example of this, that lower graphic always reminds me of how nature adapts. And so Monsanto and other companies sell pesticides and herbicides that will increase crop yields temporarily. But what they also do is they encourage nature to push back and evolve defenses against those chemicals. And so nature does that very handily by creating superweeds and superbugs and other things that are even more dangerous than the original pests and weeds. So another way of saying this is that when we use oversimplified linear interventions in a complex living system, usually we wind up making the original problem worse. So here's one a lot of us can relate to, not just multitasking, but always being plugged in. A psychoanalyst colleague of my acquaintance refers to this kind of snidely as the electronic umbilical cord. There's also a movie called Alone Together that looks at this. And so we have the feeling of being connected with each other and connected with huge sources of online information, and to some extent that's true. I made use of that to create this slideshow, for instance, and I'm making use of it to talk to you. But the downside of this is that it also can be quite isolating and distracting. And so when there's no time to really sit with ourselves and sit with our feelings, then we never really mature emotionally, and we never really get a sense of our own responsibility for how we live in the world or the consequences of our actions. And we also don't get a sense of our full emotional response to the things that are happening around us. So it makes it very difficult for us to actually take action and do anything about them. At a somewhat deeper level, very often when large numbers of people don't get their basic needs met in a civilization, a wish builds up with them, and we can see this from historical studies. A wish builds up and a resentment builds up such that they actually wish that those civilizations and their systems of government will collapse. And when you want something to collapse, it's only really a very short step to making that happen. Sometimes in unconscious ways, other times more consciously. So a wish for things to just get wiped out, a wish for the current situation to just end and restart itself, start fresh, This is something that actually quite a lot of people feel, and some of us are more or less honest about it. I just wish the government would collapse. I just wish the world economy would die so that we could get it over with and start with something new. So the degree of consciousness varies, but underneath this is a resentment, but also maybe at an even deeper level is a recognition that things need to change, that there needs to be fundamental changes in many sectors of life, government and agriculture and education and finance and other things. Related to the slide I just showed you, as a psychotherapist, when I was in practice, I often saw how what usually looked like self-destructive behavior was an unconscious way of setting ourselves up to learn something important about changing our lives. I used to work, for instance, with men who had committed violent crimes and were referred to our therapy center as a result of their sentence. And very often, when we really look deeply at the violent incident that got them arrested, in some of these men, we could see that they were right on the point of realizing that they had to be different in the world. They had to think differently or transform themselves or strike out in a new direction in their lives, but they were resisting doing that. And so at an unconscious level, they set up something that looked like self-sabotage, but that was actually a way of telling themselves that they needed to move forward. I think entire civilizations do this. I think that when a civilization or a society or a country gets too out of balance with the natural world and hurts too much of it and hurts too many of its own people, then it starts doing destructive things to force itself to wake up, to force itself to realize we must live differently on this planet. We have to find earth-honoring ways to make sure that we don't go out with the other species that are now perishing in record numbers. So in some ways, it could be that the current number of environmental crises barreling down on us are, in a sense, unconsciously self-arranged so that we will wake up and do things differently. A century of psychotherapy has shown us that projection, too, is a very common psychological defense. Projection has to do with, it takes many forms, but it has to do with experiencing a part of the inner life outside of ourselves rather than inside of ourselves. And so if you look at how, especially in the industrialized nations, we treat the earth, we sometimes treat earth like a mother, but a mother we don't have to worry about. We don't have to worry about her needs. A mother that will always be there to clean up after us. A mother who never gets overstressed. And so in some ways, we, as consumers, we see Earth unconsciously through the eyes of a very young child who has not grown up enough to learn that mother has her own needs and that she does get tired and that she can't clean up some messes. This is different, by the way, from when indigenous people talk about Mother Earth and loving their mother. They're doing it from a psychologically different place, one of love and care and responsibility and an adult psychology rather than a very young psychology that takes Earth for granted. In the early 1970s, a movement started that called itself ecofeminism, and one of the things that it has studied since then are the disturbing parallels between how in patriarchal cultures women and nature are usually put together under an abstract category and similarly mistreated, similarly devalued. And so there's many symbolic parallels between how women are mistreated by patriarchy and how the earth and how nature are mistreated as well. And it's also an eco-feminist thesis that patriarchy actually is in fact responsible for a lot of the ecological damage that we see, and that we need to interrogate deeply into patriarchy and heal it in order to have a better life on this planet. I think we've all known people, and some of us have been these people. I was a bit this way when I was younger, where if an authority or a parent tells you to do something, then you not only do the opposite, but you do the opposite with twice the force in order to be an irritant. And so this is a picture of something that's relatively new. It's called rolling coal. And the way it works is the people who drive like this, and this is trucks and even tractors, they hear President Obama talk about the need to combat global warming. And so, because he's an authority figure that they disagree with, they respond to him with this reactionary rebellion, and they pollute even more. So an automatic, uncritical running away from anything that an authority says, whether political, scientific, religious, or what have you, can also serve as a defense against realizing that in some cases, anyway, maybe they know what they're talking about. And the last defense I'll mention, in societies that have an intact religious structure that serves a lot of people, one of the advantages to that, there are also disadvantages to it, obviously, as well, but one of the advantages is that people have a more or less socially sanctioned pathway to the sacred. In societies that don't have that, then people tend to find pathways to the sacred in unconscious ways. In other words, they tend to worship things that ordinarily wouldn't be worshipped. And that used to be called idolatry, and the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm talks a lot about that in his books, how instead of being in a relationship to something that we experience as sacred, whether that's a god or life itself or the qualities of the earth or what have you, instead we experience machines or technology as sacred. And so the locus of power that would reside in within us, the locus of decision making and valuing, passes over into things that are outside us. And long ago, Emerson had a comment about this. He said, "Things are in the saddle and ride mankind." And so what this looks like today oftentimes is a hope that machinery and technology will save us, that we will invent our way out of the current crisis. And we might. There might actually be some sort of a clean power source that can fill all our needs that will be invented tomorrow, or some incredible way of taking all the extra carbon out of the atmosphere that could be discovered at any time. But what makes this a defense is that it puts all our hope in the possibility of such a discovery without taking any accountability for actually making the changes in our lifestyle that are necessary to live on this planet in harmony with its natural cycles and with its other species as well. So it takes all the power out of us and it puts us into possibilities and hopes. So in this last section, I want to deal a bit with how to face this sort of denial and what to do about it in ways that are productive psychologically. And I really like this quotation from Alice Walker, so I'll start with that. "As long as the earth can make a spring every year, I can. As long as the earth can flower and produce nurturing fruit, I can, because I'm the earth. I won't give up until the earth gives up." I had the honor to be invited to an event called Bioneers a few years back. It's a forum for ecological scientific thinkers, cultural thinkers too, who are re-envisioning ways to live on this planet. And I was asked at the end of my presentation some questions, and one of the questions was, what psychological advice do you have for us activists who are trying to wake people up to things like global warming? So one of the pieces of advice I gave them, and that I give my students as well, is don't just talk about the bad stuff. Don't just talk about the scary stuff. Especially these days, if you hear it on the radio or on the internet or on TV or what have you, it's so easy to just change the channel and not listen. So if you want to reach people, yes, be realistic about the ecological trouble that we're in, because we're in a lot, actually, but present some of the positive things that are happening, some of the ways that people are taking responsibility into their own hands and stepping up. New cultural ways of being, new technologies, new relationships with animals and with nature, new ways to plan and grow things. that don't depend on mass agriculture and monocropping. There's so many experiments being done around the world, and it's really easy to find out what a lot of them are. So presenting that to people makes it difficult to argue with success. And it also invites people who have an underlying fear of what's happening, because that's what denial is really about. It's about fear of facing what the reality is. It invites those people to at least consider that, well, it's not all bad news. We're an innovative species. There's a lot of fascinating things happening right now. I also told that group, quit shaming the public. Quit indulging in green puritanism. Quit making people feel guilty because they don't recycle enough, or because they eat the wrong foods, or because they drive SUVs or whatever. Totally ineffective, especially in a country like ours that has a long history of religious education that's shame-based. The last thing a lot of us want to hear is more shaming. So don't do that. I just mentioned that denial and this applies to the other defense mechanisms too. They're about fear. They're about an inability to face up to the fear. So one way to come at that is to actually empathize with the fear and the other feelings that are underneath the denial. Sometimes when I've talked to people who say, well, it's great what you're doing, all this ecological stuff, but global warming is frankly a hoax, or it's a liberal conspiracy, or whatever. Usually what I'll do is I'll slide right past the content of what they said, and I'll say, it really is hard to face up to all this. I mean, it means that we have to live differently. It means that perhaps that we have to absorb things happening around us that are unpleasant and scary, and that may even make us sad or angry. It is tough to step up to this. But if we do, there's hope. And so sometimes empathizing with what's underneath the denial can invite people into moving beyond it. Confronting it head on is seldom effective. I think this is probably the most important item in terms of dealing with climate denial, is providing safe places so people can talk about how they feel about it. When you give people catastrophic information about climate change or mass extinction or whatever else is happening, and you don't give them a place to talk about what that does to them psychologically, usually the first thing they'll do is employ a defense, and then they'll just be numb. And so giving people this kind of news can actually make them number and more uncaring than if they had never heard the news at all. So it's so important to provide some sort of a circle or a group or a forum for people to be able to discuss these things. And we've started doing that at the school I work at, the California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, and also at Holos Institute, which is a nonprofit psychotherapy business in the Bay Area. They do that as well. They sometimes have walk-in circles where the therapist interns who work there will just talk to people right off the street about how they're feeling. And what I've seen happen in those settings, but other ones, conferences and classrooms, is that when people have that forum, they tend not to stay with the despair and the sorrow and the anger and other things that come up for them. They need to go through those, but they tend to move fairly quickly into questions like, what can I do about this? How can I change this? How can I peacefully work toward a different kind of world to live in? And so this number 4, provide safe settings for discussion, it's all important, I think, in terms of how to deal with all of this defense and denial against what's happening ecologically to the planet. Another good move. A lot of our economic and political thinking is based on the idea of scarcity. It's been that way actually for thousands of years. I call it the age of empires. The idea that the only way to govern people is to control what they need to survive. And so that creates an atmosphere of thinking in terms of what people don't have instead of what they do have. And so we need to move away from the scarcity thinking of fossil fuels, of limited transportation options, limited food options, to recognize the boundless possibilities for all of those things that exist in the natural world. Unlimited sunlight, unlimited wind and wave power. all there for our use if we want to be smart about it. Whatever we can do to educate people about how to think in terms of systems and relationships and feedbacks and ecology can also be helpful. When people are in denial, often a component of that is that they simply don't have the mental tools they need for understanding what's happening. And so, if you can think in terms of ecosystems, then you have a different set of tools for coming at unpleasant realities and for influencing them in some ways to be less harmful than they could otherwise be. It's hard to face up to ecological crisis alone on a planetary scale. So it's necessary for all of us to be able to network with other people who are getting that kind of education. These are some of the organizations that I've had dealings with. There are many others, though. So it's really important to get not only support, but also knowledge and feedback from other people who have similar concerns as we find out about all this and think about how to do things differently. There's a truth that I learned a while ago, which is that people will not protect what they do not love. And sometimes it can be difficult to love an ailing planet. But it's so necessary to be able to tune in to the beauty that's still around us and to appreciate the complexity and the intelligence of the natural world. So it's so necessary. There is right now a number of studies being done to give you a scientific example of what I mean. A number of studies being done on soil bacteria that actually elevates mood, um, diminishes depression and anxiety, good for the body, good for the mind. So if you garden without gloves on, or if you simply put your hands in or carry around fresh soil for 20 minutes, you can see for yourself if there's any effect on your mood and your stress. It's just one of many things that emphasize how intimately related our well-being is with the well-being of the natural world, and that what happens to it happens to us as well. One of the things I saw when I worked with highly traumatized people is that as one of the more terrible effects of what they went through, they lost the ability even to imagine better possibilities for how they could live. And so, as one of these possibilities, I like to talk about the current ecological crises as a vast planetary rite of passage for our species. That if we can get through this and outgrow our earth harming behaviors and grow up psychologically to become responsible adults, then on the other side of that await a number of good things: a clean planet to live on, better relations, and more peaceful relations with each other. These are realistic possibilities. They're so realistic that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. referred to this as beloved community. He often said that the idea that we can live with each other in peace and justice is not some utopic fantasy. It's something that is being done now, and it can be done. The task for us is to do it as a species. And in all this, for sure, don't forget to keep your sense of humor handy. We have a big task ahead of us as a species, probably the biggest we've ever had to face. And as Camus put it, we have nothing to lose except everything. It's a scary time to live right now, but it's also an incredibly exciting time. It's a time to really step up and show what we can do as individuals and as a species on its way to a different kind of relationship with our planet and with ourselves and each other. Thank you.